Hi, it's Alexander Russo with The Grade, and this is the Education Show. And I am so happy to be here with Bellwether's Nora Weber to talk about this amazing new report about how the national press covers education. Nora, welcome to the show. Thank you so much for being here.
Thank you, Alexander, for having me. Really excited to be here.
Before we get started with the findings of the report and the 100 million questions that I have about it, I wanted to ask you something personal about your background, your connections to either education or your connections to journalism.
Yeah.
Uh, I'm a second career journalist. I did politics for a long time and taught for a minute. How about you? What's your backstory?
I've had sort of a long trip getting to the position I'm in now, but have been very involved in education for as long as I can remember, doing everything from tutoring to I taught abroad for a year, and then during graduate school taught in a university setting as well, and have always been focused on education. So my graduate work is in sociology of education, and I knew that I wanted to continue doing applied education research, just as an area that is personally very interesting to me and such a huge part of everyone's experience in growing up and life. And so that led me to my work at Bellwether today, where I am a senior analyst and do evaluation and policy research.
Excellent. Well, the reason we're here is because you and some others at Bellwether put out this amazing report, which takes a look back at the education coverage from 12 national outlets. Before we get to the findings of the report, what's the backstory here? What made you want to do this? Where does this come from, and how did it take shape?
Yeah, so Bellwether is a national nonprofit, and we do a lot of work that is client facing, that is helping education leaders, teachers, parents, everyone who's interested engaged in education, other education nonprofits, collect and analyze data that can help them serve that mission. But we also do field facing work. And so Bellwether's field facing work aims to share what we're learning about education, learning about the field, and share it with others so that they can have that as they're making decisions about education practice, about education policy, and just as they're thinking about education. So I think in this past year, we've published more than 60 new reports, which you can find on the website. And those speak to commentary pieces, practical resources like toolkits and things like that. And then we also have a series of blog posts that are authored by Bellwether experts that cover things about news and trends in the sector.
So, where does a report on media come from? Is this something that Bellwether's done before that I've just never seen? Were you jealous of the AEI reports on media coverage, or of my half-assed efforts to use Media Cloud to do these kinds of reports in the past? Where's this from?
Yeah, that's a great question. So this is part of our initiative to learn more about the way that education is being covered in the news, and just this interest in, obviously we spend a lot of time talking with people about how education is and the issues that we're thinking about education in the classroom, at the district level, at the state level, but we were really interested as well in thinking about how is the media then covering education? How is a broader picture? So more of a sort of traditional research approach in doing this content analysis, and something that myself and my colleagues have experience doing from other work. But yeah, being able to have this information internally to think about the way that we are studying education, and then to share it with the field so that members of the sector can really think about what might be missing here, what they might want to see more of, or what trends they're just seeing and how they respond to those.
You don't have to tell me, but I'm imagining in my fantasy world there's a meeting or a conversation or something happens, and you or someone else at Bellwether say, "We got to do this." Are you willing to tell me about the meeting that I'm imagining or the moment that I'm imagining?
So unfortunately, I was not involved in that very decision making, so I can't speak to that. I know this is a topic that we certainly are talking about across many of our teams, and saying, wow, it would be so great to know how the media is covering education at a national level. And something that has, in other analyses, is something that would be really an important piece of contextual information. That unfortunately was not my lone decision to spearhead this project, but I came in very excited when I found out that we were going to be able to pursue this as a
Good.
question.
Uh, uh, Even if their origin is a mystery, I'm still so glad that it happened. During the pandemic, some folks, I think at Dartmouth, did an analysis of COVID coverage, and ended up with this theory about the bad news bias in U.S. coverage versus European English language coverage. It's a fascinating thing to look at these differences or trends or patterns in the media. And I obviously, given what I've been doing for the last 10 years, think that media coverage is important because it shapes perceptions and decisions, and is a source of inspiration and frustration for all of us.
Yeah,
Are you
absolutely.
ready? Are you ready to talk about the findings?
Let's do it. Yeah, let's get into it.
Okay. 1 year, 12 outlets, 1,500 pieces coded by you and AI, not you personally, but humans and AI. What did you find?
Yeah, so this was a really interesting study, and we had a number of findings going in. So again, we were interested in doing this as very much an exploratory study. We had determined that we wanted to look at national news coverage. So we looked and selected a set of publications based on getting coverage across radio, broadcast, and print media. And then we were looking at their online presence specifically, but we wanted to make sure that we were getting coverage broadly of education. And so those helped us sort of scope or set up the scope of the research. And then going into it, we really wanted to understand first, what are the main themes that are being talked about in coverage? What are some of the trends we see in terms of time frame? And so over the course of this year, is coverage steady? Is coverage varying a lot based on seasonality or major events? And so that led into those are sort of the questions that were guiding us going into this, but we were really open to see what do we find out when we take this exploratory look at the news. And so a couple of the major findings, which we detail in the report, the big headline was that fewer than 1 in 10 articles was focused on issues around teachers, around curriculum and instruction, and extracurriculars and student academic outcomes. So a lot more of the news coverage was around political education coverage. It was around highly politicized topics and highly debated topics in the news. It was also around issues like gun violence that were being covered not so much as in debate or in conversation about the gun violence and schools, but more as instances and events happened that were created these spikes. So the first thing we had was finding some of these themes, and looking back at the report, we see that the top 5 themes that emerged from the study were coverage of the U.S. Department of Education. So that was everything, particularly around the administration's new approach to thinking about the Department of Education, conversations about shutting it down completely, the firing of large number of federal employees in the U.S. Department of Education. Additionally, we saw a large amount of coverage around gun violence in schools. Again, those were primarily instances of school shootings that really spiked in the news and then often fell off. Coverage of sex, gender, LGBTQ plus issues and Title IX, which was about 10% of the coverage. And then the other two that hit, our other two of our top 5 were religion in schools. Those were largely around some of the big cases that came up this year around religious charter schools, having the Bible in schools, and then technology, which was an interesting combination that was largely split between cell phone bans and cell phones in schools and AI and the increasing conversations about what AI in the classroom or in schools might look like.
One of the big surprises for me, the extent of it, the big surprises for me in the findings was the amount of coverage dedicated to gun violence, school gun violence. I've tracked this for a long time. I've read and written about it a number of times. I knew it was going to be more than I wanted it to be because, for the record, schools are amazingly safe places, despite what we've all been told. But that number was just giant. I get it. It's tragic. It's terrifying, and it's a news story. But the number was much bigger than I thought it was going to be. and made me surprised and sad. What surprises or disconfirmations were there for you? You must have had some guesses, explicit or not, at what the results were going to be. What was the biggest surprise for you?
Yeah, I think to me, one of the most interesting things was the difference in the cadence across the news. So we have a really great graph, I'm biased, but a really great visual in the report where we look at the different cadence of how these top five topics were covered over the course of the year. And like you were saying, there's a large amount of coverage of gun violence in schools, which I think was both not surprising, given that these are often major news events, but what was interesting when we looked at this cadence of news is that gun violence pretty much peaked enormously around issues of school shootings or around incidences of school shootings and then dropped off pretty dramatically. And when we looked at other parts of the analysis, most of the conversation and most of the coverage of gun violence in schools was not a broader societal debate around the topic. It was really event-based coverage. This differed really widely from coverage on some of the other topics like religion in schools, where it was a combination of reporting events, Supreme Court hearings happening, and here are the details of it, and then more of thoughts around the topic as a whole. And this was the same. So we saw that gun violence in U.S. Department of Education, that coverage was really peaked around specific events and coverage of sex, gender, LGBTQ plus issues in Title IX, coverage of religion in schools, and coverage of technology in schools had more of a steady flow across the course of the year. Of course, there were still moments, where something might come up and those would have a peak, but it was a much more steady conversation. So even though it looks like, in reality it was, even though there was a lot of coverage of some of these topics, it was a different type of reporting than just talking about it
That's,
as
that's
questions.
fascinating.
Yeah.
Where does private school choice vouchers, ESEA, where do those stories get captured in your matrix?
Yeah, we have. So if you look at our list of topics, we have a section on school choice. So we have it is called school choice, and about 3%. So there are about 45 articles in this sample of coverage over the course of the year that looked at questions around school choice.
I asked because that was the category that seemed unexpectedly small to me. I've had the feeling that every fifth article that I've read for the last 2 years has been about choice, even though choice itself is small, growing quickly but small. I was wondering whether it got coded into some other category because that seems low to me.
Yeah, I think it's possible that some of it, so when you're coding, and this gets a little bit into the technicalities of it, when you're coding an article to say what's the main theme, you sometimes have to make decisions. And for some of these articles, we had to decide what's the main thing this is about. So a question might talk about school choice in talking about religion in schools, for instance, but that if it was predominantly about religion, then we would code that as religion in schools. So there's certainly a little bit of fuzziness in doing this type of news analysis, and we had to sit down, and it was a lot of conversations and a lot of looking at an article between multiple people and saying, okay, do we all agree that this is mostly about this? So certainly, I think you could look at some of the articles around religion in schools, and in particular, and that was an area where you might see more about the school choice.
The only thing more fun than talking about who's at the party and how the party is going is talking about who's not at the party. Can we talk about the people who are not at the party?
Absolutely.
Um, AP has this big, amazing education team.
Mhm.
I'm a big fan of it. That's no secret. ProPublica is another big outlet with an education team. How did you decide who got to come to the party and who didn't get an invitation?
Yeah, absolutely. Again, when you're doing a content analysis, you have to make some practical choices in addition to you're thinking strategically, but you also have a limited amount of time. As you saw, even with just these 12 news sources, we had over 1,500 articles. And so every additional source that you add can really increase the sample. So we were very deliberative in thinking about who are some of the top cable and news network channels based on their reach, their audience size. Same
Mhm.
with print, and largely print. We're looking at the online sections, but thinking about print news, who has the largest circulation, and then radio as well. I would have more time, given more time and more resources, it would be incredible to look across a really wide range. And I think when we're looking at the results and we're thinking about what are some of the follow-up questions that we might have and what are some follow-up analyses that people would be interested in seeing, certainly broadening the scope of the media sources that are in there, it would be really incredible to be able to include a broader reach and do that comparison there.
The AP and the Republican people are just crying at home for the last few days. Why
Send
were
them,
we
yeah,
left?
my apologies.
No, no, that's fine. Speaking of the folks that you looked at, I tend to focus on, in my work, I tend to focus on the newsrooms, the news outlets that have dedicated education staff, as opposed to the newsrooms that produce a lot of education stories. As your analysis points out, you don't have to have an education editor, an education team. You don't have to have a page for education in order to put out a lot of education stories. Can we talk a little bit about, and often that's the case with news, with TV outlets, right? You have Fox in there, you have MSNBC. Who else do you have that's a broadcast video-based outlet?
Yeah, Fox, MSNBC, CNN, ABC, and CBS.
Right. To my knowledge, there are few, if any, self-identified full-time education reporters at those places. If they exist and I've missed them, apologies. Send me your irate emails now. Was there a differentiation that you saw between the folks putting out stories via cable news or streaming versus the online print copy, sort of word-based stories? Was there any major differentiation that you saw? I didn't really actually see one, but I'm wondering if you did.
I don't think we did as much. So if we have we visualized what it looks like in terms of percent of coverage, and it was actually really interesting to see that, for instance, CNN had the highest number of education coverage over the course of the year. Right. A large part of that was responding to breaking news around gun violence in schools. So they were the top source covering school shootings. And then Washington Post, NBC, Fox, USA Today, and the New York Times, each of them had a 10%, 10 to 12% accounted for 10 to 12% of the coverage. I think that was primarily the difference that we saw among the sources. And we do have a visual that looks at some of the different topics. So again, gun violence was covered by almost all of the sources, CNN leading the way, NBC as well. In terms of coverage of the U.S. Department of Education and changes there, and firings and things like that, we saw that USA Today actually had the most coverage of the Department of Education, which was interesting and certainly was surprising to me, not necessarily what I would have expected. So there were some trends we saw by individual sources, but yeah, that were interesting.
Who covered kids, outcomes, curriculum and instruction, teachers? Did anyone stand out on that front? I mean, that relatively speaking, was anyone least worse at that?
I would say no. No, unfortunately, no. We didn't see that there was one source that really stood out. Again, that was a pretty small portion of the coverage, and so when we're looking at it, we're seeing this heat map of what were the topics that each of these sources did cover, and that was not the hotspot for any of the sources that we looked at.
As I mentioned at the top of the interview, AEI and others have done versions of this before, tried to do versions of this before. I don't know if you had time or interest in looking back, but I'm curious about similarities or differences. AEI sometimes was trying to look at bias, ideological bias. I think they did a headline analysis one year. Did you do anything with bias, and have you had time or interest in comparing your findings to other people's findings?
I would certainly love to take a look at what other people have found. Again, it's always interesting when you're doing a content analysis. One of the choices you have to make is around the time frame that you're going to look at. I think most people would say that the last year we've got a presidential election, we've got huge changes and approaches to the US Department of Education, we've got a number of executive orders that came out. It's not a typical news cycle. And so I think that could be a really interesting comparison point to look at prior analyses and see what do we see that looks similar or different. Obviously, with the caveat that maybe they were looking at different sources, maybe they looked at different types of, if they were doing headline analysis, it's a little different than what we did looking at the full text. But I would love to take a look at those and see what differences or similarities or what additional questions that might raise looking forward and thinking about what could we do in the future that would help round out this conversation.
Right. I think they were a few years ago. The AEI one that I'm recalling was a few years ago. I think they were relying on brainiacs and regular old computers, not AI.
Okay. Yeah.
So there's not going to be apples to apples, but this is just a fascinating and interesting thing. And I can't help but note, I know that you're not making recommendations, you're just presenting information here, but it's hard not to note that the coverage pattern that your research finds pushes out or pushes very far to the side literacy, attendance, math instruction, student well-being. There's so many stories that don't get covered just in the limited time and attention that we have. And anyway, it's quite amazing. Those charts that you presented are quite amazing to look at.
Thank you.
Tulat,
I think too, when we were thinking about sort of what are the implications, again, would love to hear from more people, people like yourself, people who are media experts, and hear what the response is and hear how they're thinking about it. Is this something that is it to be expected in a presidential shift, in a year with a lot of federal changes, or is this something that surprises them as well? It sounds like it was surprising to you.
Yeah,
which is
definitely was. Surprising in the worst kind of surprising way. Speaking of responses, have you gotten any responses? Are you taking this to education journalism leaders, to editors, and asking them for their thoughts? What has the reaction been other than mine?
So I don't know the extent to which our external relations team has been talking with other people. I know it's gotten a little bit of coverage. I personally was following some of the responses that we got to the post on LinkedIn, which I'm always, again, as a researcher, really, really interested to see what resonates with people, especially in a study like this that's very exploratory. And I think some of the things that we've been talking about were questions that people raised. These are largely people that work at in education institutions or other research institutes. So I know people had asked questions around doing comparisons between earlier time periods and the current one, looking at a larger span of media outlets, or looking at the comparison between national outlets and local coverage to see, is there a difference in the way that education is being covered at these two sort of media levels. So those are some of the questions, I think, a lot of sparking additional considerations. I think a lot of people were also not surprised, or were surprised rather, and were similarly disappointed to see less coverage of things around student outcomes, around curriculum and instruction, extracurriculars, etc.
Yeah, it feels like a confirmation. I had one reporter say to me not too long, when does education journalism get to go back to education? Because stories get so focused on politics, culture, war issues, societal events, rather than teaching and learning. So this reporter was saying, when can we go back to the education beat? And I'm glad you're getting these kinds of reactions. Is there any plan to interest from you guys, from funders, to do more on this?
I know there's internal interest. I don't know if that's going to become a possibility. Certainly, I am interested in this sparked so many questions for me, and I would be really interested in continuing to look at the news, either again retrospective or the comparison between federal and local news, or continuing to look forward and see what does we've seen what the past year, so middle of 2024 to middle of 2025 looked like. What does this coming year look like? And do we see trends that are similar or different? We might
And
expect something different, in the second year of a presidential term versus the first. Maybe we'd
right.
be surprised.
And could you go back? You've done all the hard work. Could you go back to 23 to 24, the year before the study, press a button, and just get a new report for the previous year?
So it's a content analysis following best practice. And I do want to emphasize that we put so much time and effort into planning this, and there's a lot that goes into developing the themes, for instance. So it's those were all developed inductively by us, the researchers. We worked with a media partner, Mercury, to send them the definition of what types of articles, what sources we were pulling from. They provided us with the full media clip, and then we read through a random sample of articles to start to identify themes. We worked as a team to refine this list. I think we went through 5 different, we call it code books, until we got to our final list of themes. So if we were to look at a different period of time, we couldn't necessarily assume that the exact same themes are going to show up. We would want to make sure to do that whole process again and read through a sample. There's a lot of testing and back and forth before we confirmed that. But certainly we could look to see what's the prevalence of these themes that we know right now are happening or have happened over the past year. If we did an analysis from a prior year, we could certainly look and see if those were emerging.
You may not want to do this, and it might be an enormous amount of work, but I'm hoping that this is the Bellwether's annual media study, and that we get lots more of the stuff. I think it's incredibly helpful for journalists and people whose work is covered or who consume education journalism, or who make decisions by it, to know what the patterns are, and journalists especially, for them to be able to know how much time they spent on a topic. They only has so many hours. The year only has so many weeks. For education newsroom leaders to be able to go, is that how we wanted things to go? Or, I mean, I'm sure every individual decision is easily justifiable. What's news is a decision that journalists make every day, but the being able to see the cumulative pattern by outlet, it's just quite amazing. And I hope that the editors and education editors at NPR and the Wall Street Journal, and the New York Times and all the other outlets will take a look and think about whether this is what they wanted to be doing or what would have been most useful to do cumulatively.
First of all, thank you for the kind words about the report. Certainly, that's the hope when you do this type of analysis, is that people will find it interesting, people will find it informative, and people will think about how might the results of this influence my work, might change the way that I think about the work that I'm doing. And so, yeah, I again hope that we're able to connect this with other people in the media as well, and that maybe, yeah, there are internal conversations that happen and they reflect on the results. And again, we'd be happy to talk with them and, yeah, and hear what their perspective on this is too.
I hope that happens. I hope you guys do it again and include AP and ProPublica,
Mhm.
if you can. And most of all, I really appreciate your coming on and talking about what you found and how you found it. And please let me know if and when you do something next.
Absolutely.
Thanks so much for being on the show. I really appreciate it.
Thanks, Alexander. You too.